is populated by countless varieties of animal life, all well adapted to their environments. But amongst them, man is the unquestioned king. Zoologists often speculate about what exactly it is that has led to this dominance. Man was a highly skilled and organized hunter. He was able to shape and use tools as an extension of his muscle power. And long ago, he mastered the use of fire. The use of fire allowed him to shape materials, as well as helping him to protect and comfort his family. He began to control the use of the land and became not only a hunter, but a farmer. Families came together, pooled their resources, and through the command of speech, tribal society evolved. But of all these individual skills, the one thing that marks him out as unique in the animal kingdom is the use of a written language. It is this that has made him easily the most successful creature on the planet.
This simple but sensationally important skill, the ability to make little marks on stone, on wood and later on paper, was in fact one of man's most significant inventions. The moment he realized that these little squiggles could be used to convey information to others of his kind, he freed himself from the shackles of space and time. His ideas could be conveyed to other parts of the world, his knowledge could be stored to survive his death, and the accumulating treasure house of his culture could be passed on from generation to generation. The whole of our civilization depends upon this simple fact, the colossal usefulness of a written, permanent language. Early written language was cumbersome and imprecise, and remained so as long as replication of the message had to be carried out by hand copying. The invention of printing had dramatic effects, sweeping the world out of the Middle Ages and into the era of modern science.
The world we live in today is unbelievably different from that of our long-forgotten ancestors who made those simple but highly significant marks. But the way we communicate hasn't really changed that much. It's still a question of making physical marks on a physical medium of some kind. Now, after thousands of years, we're about to give up this antiquated method of storing our knowledge, replacing it with electronic language. Computers can now hold enormous amounts of information, displaying it on command, using electronic switches operating at 1 billion times a second with ease. In the 1960s, the American space effort eventually led to the tiny microprocessor, capable of handling enormous amounts of information. And here at Cape Canaveral, housed in one of the largest buildings in the world, the next step in the computer revolution is being taken a stage further with the development of the space shuttle.
To provide giant capacity memories for the communication satellites of the 1980s, which the space shuttle is going to throw into orbit, NASA have contracted the engineering firm of Rockwell to squeeze as much information as they can into a tiny space. Now, already using the technique known as bubble memory, they've been able to squeeze 250,000 bits of information, that's roughly 10 or 20,000 words of English text, into this single unit.
The bubble memory holds its information even with the electrical current switched off. It's also extremely small. Traditionally, computers store their data on magnetic tape or disks. They take up lots of room and need mains electricity to drive them. But the bubble memory avoids these problems and is ideal for those applications like the shuttle where space is at a premium.
In even more remarkable developments, Rockwell have produced for the space shuttle this memory package containing 100 megabits of information. That's 100 million bits. Now, those numbers aren't really easy to understand, and the best thing one can think of is to give the example and say that it was the equivalent of all the text in this volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and in this one, and in these. But even this is just the beginning. On the drawing board are plans to compress all that information onto one single chip. Now again, this needs some explanation. Supposing that I programmed this computer to print all that text out 8 hours a day, 5 days a week at reading speed. How long do you think it would take?
With several thousand million individual letters to deal with, the computer would take in the region of 5 months to print it all out.
One might respond to this by saying, so what? Great for the manufacturers of satellites, but how's it likely to affect the average individual? Well, the effects are likely to be quite stunning and very far-reaching.
Just look at the enormous amounts of space which books take up, how expensive they are to produce, and how wasteful of increasingly scarce raw materials. But when the entire contents of a book are available on a single chip, this will not only save on storage space and raw materials, but will also make them fantastically cheap to produce.
So the books of the near future, perhaps the late or even the middle 80s, are going to come in the form of chips. And here's our little library. Charles Dickens' collected works, War and Peace, 1984, and so on. Let's pick 1984. Okay, the book's there on the chip, but how do you read it? Well, you pick up this thing which looks very like a book, but when you open it up, it turns out to be something quite different. It's actually a chip reader. There's a display screen for the text to come up, a number of buttons, and most important of all, a little point where you plug in your book.
Now you can switch it on, and the computer will remember where you were when you last read the book. But let's say you want to start. You push the read button, and up comes the text. You can select the page number, the size of type, and even a different type style. Although this is just a mock-up, it may not be long before we see this kind of book coming off the production lines.
Today's books are passive things, which sit there silently on shelves, waiting for you to do something with them. Tomorrow's books will be dynamic. They'll have miniature personalities of their own, and they'll almost come down from the shelves, begging you to make use of them. And with this will come another revolution in education. Now, as you read it through...
Gallant though the efforts of today's teachers are, no one's going to pretend that our education system is anywhere near perfect. Only the very wealthy can afford the ideal personal tuition. The vast majority of mankind are stuck with the old system of teaching. One human desperately trying to share out his knowledge with classes of 30 or even 40 not particularly willing children.
If you look at 5C, it says, besides bridges... The first, the biggest and the most ambitious assault on this problem has come from Project Plato in the state of Illinois, where a big computer has been hooked up to over 1,000 terminals and where literally tens of thousands of students have been and are being routinely taught by computer. Now, the range of teaching programs available is enormous. Every student, of course, has personal tuition, and some remarkable results have been achieved. This computer is the heart, or I suppose you should say the brains of the Plato system. By world standard, it's not a particularly big computer, but it knows the names of thousands of students and how well or how badly they're doing at any particular moment. It's also got in its memory over 15,000 teaching programs, ranging from rudimentary spelling right up to advanced clinical medicine. Most stunning of all, perhaps, is the fact that it goes about its business 24 hours a day without a single human being supervising it. It's totally dedicated, endlessly patient, and supremely tolerant. A teaching computer which is a staggering foretaste of the future of world education.
Microprocessors, doing away with the need for a big central computer, are now beginning to appear in English schools. but lack of funds for research and technology have meant that computer-aided instruction has not developed at anywhere near the pace it has in the USA. But in the very near future, money may no longer be a factor, as teaching devices based on microprocessors shrink in size and cost. One of the first straws in the wind has been the Little Professor, a simple but effective drill and practice aid to mathematics. Costing about £10, it was really one of the earliest pocket teaching computers. These devices are very popular with school children, but no one pretends that they're particularly powerful teaching aids, and certainly they're no substitute for a real live teacher. From America's giant Texas Instruments Corporation have come a number of more advanced teaching aids, again based on the chip. One of them even speaks.
F-G-H. That is correct. Now spell once.
The voice is not a tape recording. The microprocessor itself is generating these speech sounds, albeit with a transatlantic accent.
E. That is incorrect. The correct spelling of once is O-N-C-E, once.
British research has not been lagging behind. The Mini system, here seen giving a lesson in French, was the world's first pocket teaching computer and was developed at the National Physical Laboratory in Middlesex.
World expenditure on armaments, which basically means on weapons of destruction, now runs into hundreds of billions of pounds every year. It's not surprising there's a huge industry and lots of spectacular hardware to show for it. In comparison, how much would you say was spent on education? Most people think only a fraction, but the answer is actually very surprising.
We now spend more on education than on defence. Yet only a few years ago, global spending on education was 4% less than on defence. These huge sums of money are needed simply to keep the giant educational system ticking over. New schools and the maintenance of old ones, teachers' salaries, books and paper, increasingly expensive these days. None of these vast sums, of course, had to be set aside for educational technology for the simple reason that there just hasn't been any educational technology to spend money on. But in the coming years, all that's about to change. In a capitalist society, when people see a way of making money out of something, they tend to pump large sums of investment capital into it. And no more promising area, an untapped reservoir of potential riches exists than the field of education. In the 1980s, huge sums of money are likely to be siphoned into developing, firstly, miniaturized teaching computers, and secondly, studying the nature of the educational process in order to provide the computers with effective teaching programs.
The truth of the matter is we know very little about education. What constitutes a good teacher, a good pupil, a good lesson, a good teaching strategy. And one of the richest harvests of the computer revolution may be that by giving us an educational technology, it steers us at last towards a science of education.
The arrival of powerful personal tutors will inevitably lead to a greater proportion of the education process being undertaken at home, and may even mean that the school system as we know it will decline into redundancy.
The teaching computers of the 1980s are totally unlike the teaching machines of the 1960s, which were such conspicuous failures. Instead of being repetitive and mechanical, they're intelligent and intriguing and patient, and they come equipped with a fascinating range of knowledge.
The children are allowed about 30 minutes a day on the computer. The teachers write the programs, and with the computer's help, keep a constant eye on their progress. In fact, the scheme is so successful that punishment means being denied time on the machine, whilst reward comes in the form of a teaching game or two.
Before you do it. So you have to do it pretty quickly.
Now, it's already obvious that games are going to feature very strongly in the teaching programs of tomorrow, because it's through games that we get most closely to man's competitive instincts. Now, here's, first of all, a very simple example of a powerful game which teaches remedial English, beginners in English, foreigners learning to speak English, and so on. What it really consists of is a set of pictures and a set of names, nouns, words of various kinds, and you have to make up a sentence by juggling the pictures and the words around on the screen. You do this by touching the screen in particular places. Now, the computer will understand a logical sentence. It won't let you create a nonsense sentence, so to speak. Okay, so here's the little pictures in the set, and I'll make up a sentence straight away. The
girl, shrubs, shrub, tree, to, house.
So there's the sentence. When I'm ready to see what the computer does with it, push the next button.
The girl runs from the tree to the house.
It speaks the sentence and then draws up a little cartoon to go with it. Now, if we want to make up a nonsense sentence, we see what the computer does with it. The
tree, shrub, to, girl.
The tree from to girl is obvious nonsense.
Sorry, I do not understand that.
The computer says it can't understand it. These are parts of a chemical apparatus, and the task is to assemble them correctly. So let me try this first of all. And it says put on the condenser and the adapter first. Must be the condenser, belongs up there, that's fine. That'll be the adapter, goes there. Now, that retort thing probably goes at the bottom. It does. This, try it up there. No, it says the thermometer goes there, so let's put it down to there. These are the thermometers. One goes over there. One goes up the top, now I know that. Here's the water bath that comes over there. And now the whole thing fills up, and we're ready to start the experiment.
We can push it over a little bit, maybe.
This game, where one attempts to land a spacecraft on the moon, was developed about 10 years ago and needs a very powerful computer to drive it. But the microchip will bring this kind of sophistication to the home computer in the next few years.
Yeah, take out your fuel.
The light pen, which emits pulses of electrons when it touches the screen, makes this game truly interactive. The computer constantly assesses your decisions and then acts on them. It's a very skillful game, and if you're successful, the astronaut lands and heads for a nearby McDonald's.
Oh, that's nice.
Even today's rudimentary computer games have a fascination which is almost frightening, and their immensely sophisticated descendants will be even more compelling and powerful. There are dangers here, of course. There's the risk of creating an introverted society in which the individual begins to move away from areas of social interaction, retreating into the ever more enticing comforts of the home. The trend is already partly established in those parts of the world where the urban environment is irredeemably squalid and where man has begun to sink into his own cocoon of safety and luxury. Certainly the coming of the cheap and powerful microprocessor will hasten this trend along, and in more ways than one. Each day in our frantic society, millions of people climb into motor cars and public transport and stream into the centers of huge cities. And what do they do when they get there? They write on bits of paper, pass bits of paper to each other, read the bits of paper others have passed to them, and then either pop them in the mail to turn up on somebody else's desk the next day, or they file them away to be forgotten. And after all this, they get back in their cars, buses, and trains, and go back home again. The whole thing seems pretty pointless, doesn't it? And not by any stretch of the imagination is it pleasant. And yet it has to be endured because it's the only way in which a paper-oriented society can conduct its business.
But a society which stores and transfers information electronically will operate on quite different lines. Information will pass from point to point, not on cumbersome pieces of paper, but in the form of electronic signals, which can be transmitted over vast distances by microwave or satellite. This New York executive, for instance, can handle most of his office work with his own computer terminal. It can help him keep in touch with his departments, arrange appointments with colleagues, in fact, all the day-to-day routines normally carried out in the office. But in the future, people may not even need to go to the office. The trend is already present, as women with specialist skills, such as computer programming, are already doing the bulk of their work in the comfort of their own home.
You found them yet? Oh, you've got your book.
It is curious to think that in the coming years, the computer in the home may well help to cement family relationships, which have been put increasingly at risk by the stress caused through our traditional patterns of work, and which have taken centuries to evolve.
Good morning. Pardon?
Every day, communication with the computer is becoming easier. These experimental systems already exist, which recognize the human voice and act on spoken commands.
That's nice. That's not so good.
At this rate, there will come a time when you simply talk to your front door, and it will open, having recognized your voice pattern.
Thanks. Excellent. Oh, you choose for me. Okay, goodbye.
Of course, the idea of having the computer as your only friend is fairly repellent to most of us. After all, people like going to work, talking to others, and even surviving the nightmare journey home. But in the coming decades, with satellites beaming information down to your house, and your personal computer generally helping with anything from your business accounts to your children's education, it may not altogether be a bad thing. The one note of warning is sounded by the compelling nature of the computer itself. Increasingly, it will draw you into an obsessive embrace where the world comes to you in your home. The current limitless fascination with microprocessor-based toys is but a tiny indicator of the trend towards an introverted society. With the computer as an increasingly interesting and useful companion, could the factories and office blocks empty, commuter lines fall silent, as we retreat into our own private universe? Does all this sound like the worst kind of science fiction dream? In the next program, we'll consider these very real possibilities. But we'll also look at some of the problems of machine intelligence and at the long-term social and psychological consequences of the microprocessor revolution.